Hello everyone! In this lesson we're going to put the finishing touches on our simple example application, and we're also going to learn about a tool in React named useEffect. Let's get started by adding a delete button next to each of the pets in our list. So to add that button, let's find our pet component. For me it's around line number 79 or 80, but it's probably a bit different for you, but we're just looking for the function named uppercase pet. And right before the closing list item tag, we just want to add a button here. Now you don't need to do this, but because my screen is really zoomed in and I can't fit much on the screen at once, I'm actually going to wrap this bit of JSX in parentheses so that I can drop down. And I'm really only doing this so that before the closing list tag, I can drop down to add the button element here. And this way it will fit all on one line on the screen. So it's easier for you to see and follow along with me. Okay, within this button, let's have a bit of text that says delete. And then what do we want to do when the user clicks on this button? Well, let's add a prop named onClick equals curly brackets. And then we can make up a name for a function. So we haven't created this function yet, but we will in just a few seconds. Let's say handle delete. Okay, now within this overall pet function, we just need to create a function with this name. So let's say function handle delete parentheses curly brackets. Okay, and now within this function, this is where we need to stop and actually think about what we're trying to accomplish. So what we need to do is determine the ID of the pet that we just clicked delete on. And then we want to go into the state of all of our pets, find the item that has that matching ID, and remove it from the array. So let me show you how I would do that. Before we actually work on this handle delete function, let's go up to our overall our app component, right? So it's towards the top function our app, and let's look at the JSX, right? Our header area, the like area, and then we have this unordered list where we're looping through the pets. And then here we see the uppercase pet component. Well, let's add a few props to it. So after uppercase pet, let's say ID equals curly brackets, and let's just give it pet.id. Okay, and then we need to realize that we want to be able to update the state of our pets from within the pet component. And remember, that state of all of our pets actually lives in the our app component, not the pet component. So while we're here, let's also add one more prop named set pets and set it to equal curly brackets set pets, right? This is that React function that lets us change the state or update the state. Okay, with both of these props in place, let's go back down to our pet component. Okay, and now we can actually work on our handle delete function. So here's what we want to do. We want to call the props.setPets function, right? Because we want to change the state. We want to remove an item from that array of pets in state. So within these parentheses, it's our job to give it a new array with all of the pets except for the one that we just want to get rid of. Now that means we're going to need to work with the previous state value. So let's give this an arrow function. There's the previous state, arrow symbol. So let's start working with the array of pets or the previous state. And again, we don't want to call any methods on this array that would mutate it or directly change it. So instead, we can call a method named filter. Filter has nothing to do with React. It's just a part of JavaScript. So every array in JavaScript has access to filter, and it will return a brand new array. How it works is you give it a function, and it's going to run that function once for each item in the array. Now in that function, if you return a value of true, that current item you've looped to will be included in the new array that filter is generating. If you return a value of false, it will be skipped. So all we really need to do is provide a function that returns true unless the ID of the pet matches the ID of the pet button that we just clicked on. Within the filter parentheses, let's say pet to work with the pet that we've looped to. We're just creating an ES6 arrow function. And we're just going to return true if pet.id does not equal the ID of the pet that just got clicked on. So to access that ID, it would be props.id. And that's it. That's all we need to do. React will take care of everything else. So let's test this out. Let's come down to our list. Maybe I want to get rid of Fluffy the rabbit. Click delete. Perfect. Or if I add a new pet, test cat, age of 6 years old, that gets added. But if I want to remove it, just click delete. Okay, so we've completed our delete feature. At this point, let's change gears and set things up so that when the page gets reloaded, we don't lose our data. I'm sure you've noticed that anytime you change your code in CodePen, it reloads the preview area, and in our case, that means we lose any data we've manipulated. Now, this idea of persistent data in the web browser has nothing to do with React and everything to do with just the nature of web browsers. But that doesn't matter. This is still the perfect excuse to learn about something in React named useEffect. So let's do this. Let's go up into our code towards the top within our main Our App component. And let's make it so that when you first visit the page, none of these pre-existing or hard-coded pets exist. We really only ever added these pets as an example so we had something to work with. But now that we have a form that you can fill out to add pets, we don't need these anymore. So when we're saying use state and then we have square brackets and then these items, just delete all of the items and then get rid of the empty space just like this so that it says pets, use state, and then it's just an empty array, right? An empty pair of square brackets. So now down in our preview, obviously there are no pets to see. And now when someone adds a pet to the form, not only do we want to add that new pet to state, but we want to somehow persist that data in the web browser so that even if you reload the page, that data still exists. Now, even though that's more about web browsers and less about React, let me show you how we will achieve this within the context of React. So maybe right below this line when we're setting our pets state, let's add 2 comments for ourselves just to stay organized. So / to add a comment, and let's say only run once the first time this component is rendered. Okay, and then below that, let's add one more comment and say, run every time our pet state changes. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to leverage the web browser's local storage feature. Local storage has nothing to do with React, but it's how we can have persistent data within a web browser. So the very first time our component is rendered, we're going to load any existing data from local storage, load it into state. But then we also want to save our latest data back into the browser's local storage. So anytime our pet data changes, we're going to save our pet state back into the browser's local storage. Now, this whole situation of needing to do something during a certain circumstance like this is where useEffect comes into play. So let me show you what we're going to do. For this first situation, we can say useEffect. Now I should point out that just like we needed to include or create this shortcut named useState, we need to do the same thing for useEffect. So up at the very top of our code, let's add a new line and say const useEffect equals uppercase react.useEffect. Okay, so now we can actually access it by just typing useEffect. Okay, so we're actually using it here, and we want to give useEffect 2 things. So we could say A, B. While we're at it, why don't we also go ahead and use this same code under this comment, right? When we want to do something every time our pet data state changes. So useEffect A, B. Now the first argument is a function that you want to run, and the second argument is where you list the dependencies or the things that you want to watch for changes, and then only when React detects that those things have changed, only then will it actually call your function. So let's focus on this example first. We only want this function here to run the very first time that this component is rendered. Now to do that, instead of this B placeholder for the second argument, we just provide an empty array. Now down in this example, we want this function to run every time our pet state changes. So instead of this B placeholder, we would have an array, and the only item in that array that we want to watch for is our pets state. Now, in case I didn't make it clear before this moment, by default, any code that lives within a component function is going to run every time that component gets re-rendered. So useEffect is our way of including code within our component, but only actually running it at the specific times that we want to run it. Okay, at this point, let's focus on the function that we want to run only the first time that the component is rendered. So instead of the a placeholder, we can include an arrow function. So empty set of parentheses, and then the arrow symbol, curly brackets, and then inside those drop down. Okay, and actually, before we write what we want to do here, why don't we also add an arrow function for this second useEffect? So instead of that a placeholder, empty set of parentheses, arrow symbol, curly brackets. I think it actually makes more sense to begin with this function that we want to run every time our pet state changes. So if the pet data changes, we would want to save it to the web browser's local storage. So write this out with me within this second useEffect. Let's say local storage, this is just a universal web browser feature, dot set item. So every modern web browser has access to this feature, and we give this two arguments, so a comma b. The first argument is a name that you make up for this piece of data that the browser is going to store. So instead of a, why don't we call it quotes, maybe example pet data. Okay, and then instead of the second argument, or the placeholder b, we would just want to store our pets data. However, our pets data is an array, whereas local storage in the browser only accepts a simple string of text, not actual code or data. So to get around this, here's what we can do. We can say JSON, that's all uppercase, JSON dot stringify, parentheses to call that, and then just include our state, right, or our data, lowercase pets. So this is a web browser feature that will turn our data into a string of text, and then we're saving it in local storage. Cool, so now React will take care of running this each and every time our pet state changes. Now within this useEffect, we only want to run this when the component is first rendered, and this is where we would want to load any data from the web browser's local storage if it exists. So this is where we would say if, parentheses, curly brackets. For the condition, we would say only if local storage dot get item, parentheses, only if example pet data, only if it actually exists, then we would want to load it. So within these curly brackets, we could drop down and say set pets, right? This is the function that lets us update our state within the component. Okay, and then before we actually pull in the data from the browser's local storage, we would first want to parse it. Because remember, what's stored in the web browser is just a string of text. But we want to parse it so that it's actual JavaScript data, so that it's actually an array of objects. So to do that, we just say uppercase JSON dot parse, and then we would just pull in that string from local storage. So local storage dot get item, and then remember we named it example pet data. Okay, at this point, let's test out the feature. So if we add a new pet, test cat, age of 4, and add it, as expected, we see it here, but now if we cause the page to reload, so maybe in our code, if we get rid of this comment, just to trigger CodePen to reload the example area, if we check it, that data is still there. Perfect. So now if you saved your CodePen and you closed your browser and then you pulled this CodePen back up even a week or two from now, that data would persist. And even though persistent data has nothing to do with React, you're starting to see how useful the useEffect hook function can be. Let me put that comment back. Since everything in React is based around our state, it's incredibly powerful to be able to run custom functions whenever a certain piece of state changes. If you're still not crystal clear on why useEffect is so great, that's okay. Trust me, we are going to use it many times throughout this course. In fact, right now, let's improve our time area component by leveraging useEffect. Let me show you what I'm getting at. So in our code, let's find that time area component. For me, it's around line number 102. It's probably in a different spot for you, but we're just looking for time area function. And currently, we're using set timeout, and we're waiting 1 second before we update the state with the new time. And then that's going to cause this function to re-render again, which is going to run this code again, and that's going to create sort of an infinite loop of that. So instead of us needing to constantly recreate a new timeout and recreate a new timeout, it would be more efficient if we used an interval instead of a timeout. An interval is just an ongoing instance in the browser that's going to fire the function once every second. Now in the past, before we knew about useEffect, we couldn't use setInterval because remember, this function is going to rerun every time the state changes. And we wouldn't want to have an ongoing or infinite number of intervals going. However, with useEffect, we can run a bit of code only the first time this component renders. Let me show you what I mean. So in order to save a little bit of typing, I want you to copy this line into your clipboard, just this set the time line here where we're pulling in the toLocale string. Copy that. Okay, and then we can get rid of this set timeout area, and instead we can use useEffect. Remember, it takes two arguments, a comma b. For the second argument, or the b placeholder, let's say an empty array. Right, that's how you say you want something to run only the first time it renders. Okay, and then instead of the a argument, let's include an arrow function. So empty parentheses, arrow symbol, curly brackets, and then let's drop down. Okay, and now here is where we can use setInterval instead of set timeout. So we could say setInterval. This also gets two arguments, so a comma b. The second argument is how many milliseconds you want to wait in between each call, so 1000. And the first argument is a function that you want to run. So we could just include an arrow function. We don't even need curly brackets, and then you could just paste in your clipboard. Okay, and if we check our preview area, cool. So our timer is still working, only now the web browser isn't having to constantly recreate a timeout and recreate a timeout endlessly. There's just one interval that continues to run, but our code isn't going to continually rerun that and create new intervals because useEffect is only going to call this the very first time our component renders. Now this isn't super important in this simple of an application, but in the real world, whenever you're doing something in the future, you want to be able to cancel it or negate it if this component gets unmounted or removed from the page before this action completes. So for example, our application was more complex and you could navigate to a new screen that did not need to show the time. Well, then this time area component would be unmounted or it would no longer be displayed. And in that case, we would want to clear the web browser's setInterval, right? Because then it would just be a waste of computer resources. So here's what we can do. At the start of this setInterval line, we can create a constant variable. Let's call it just interval equals. Okay, and then below this line, but still within the useEffect function, whatever we return within our useEffect function is what's going to be used as its cleanup function. So let's just give it an arrow function, and then we can use the web browser's clear interval function, and we would just clear the interval that we just named interval. Big picture, within useEffect, you can return a function that React is intelligent enough to use as your cleanup function. So that if this component is no longer needed on the screen, well, the web browser has a way of cleaning up your side effects or your effects. Now, if you've made it this far, give yourself a pat on the back, because we have completed the 10 days of React, or the first chapter in this course. So where do we go from here? Well, there is definitely more to React than what we've covered so far, but the building blocks that we've covered in these 10 lessons form the foundation of what makes React so special. From here, we're going to change gears and start building an actual real-world application with a decent bit of complexity to it. So in the next chapter, we're going to start creating a social media app together. Now, creating the backend and writing the code that directly queries the database is completely outside the scope of a front-end course about React. But rest assured, in this app, we are absolutely going to be working with a real backend. We just aren't creating the backend. It's pre-created. The idea, though, is that we're going to learn everything you need to know about React in order to build a responsive, blazingly fast user interface that seamlessly communicates with real data or a real backend. At this point, we've eaten our metaphorical broccoli, and this is where our progress is just going to start skyrocketing. I'm so excited to jump into this with you, So let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next chapter. To get immediate and lifetime access to the full 15-hour video course, you can find a heavily discounted coupon link in the description for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and take care.